Okay. Today I'm going to talk about capitalism. An introduction, maybe, because economics is mostly about capitalism. Mostly? Well, or maybe. Anyway, we keep teaching about the working of the markets, economic decisions, their consequences, problems, economic problems, etc. These are all related to capitalism. In a sense, we can say that economics is a self-reflection of capitalism. If capitalism was alive, of course, was conscious about itself. Anyway, okay, maybe I have this little slides. It's about economics, but its relation to capitalism in general. So basically, in a modern society, since the late 18th century, more or less, economists and social philosophers in general had or have focused on these three problems. One problem is specifically the economic problem, the coordination of economic activities. It's an economic problem. Okay, that's better, I guess. It's about the allocation of scarce resources among alternative users and also about capital accumulation. When we talk about the distinction between the neoclassicals and the classical economists, we talked about this difference between them. Neoclassical economics is concerned with the allocation of scarce resources because for them scarcity is the most important problem. So we got to make choices, and these choices must be made rationally. Therefore, economics must deal with this allocation problem, but classical writers in general are concerned with the issue of capital accumulation. Their focus of analysis is production and the increases in the production, which is capital accumulation process or growth process in general. So these two problems are still important from the point of view of economics in general, in its various versions, such as the mainstream and non-mainstream or heterodox versions. Mainstream economists usually deal with allocation problems, choices. For them, economics is a choice theoretic discipline. But the heterodox people are usually concerned with this accumulation problem. So this is an important problem because without solving this problem of coordination of agents within a capitalist economy, a good society, no matter how you define it, cannot be established. What is coordination? This is specifically a problem of capitalisms because capitalism is constituted by markets, right? And markets have decision units in economics language. And these decision units are individual decision units. So the problem is to make these decisions in harmony within the society. This is called equilibrium, actually, in macroeconomics class. We talk about this establishment of equilibrium. Equilibrium is the equality between planned spending and the planned output or planned investment and planned savings, right? Savings decisions are made by the individual households and the investment decisions are made by firms. So these two sets of decisions must be made consistent with each other so that the economic variables such as output, employment, price level, etc., can be determined. If there's no equilibrium, if in a crisis situation, for example, it basically implies that this coordination problem was not solved in general. So this is an important problem and one of the most important, if not the most important problems of economics. The other is an ethical problem. Economics is almost by definition an ethical science still, despite the neoclassical emphasis on the allocation. And individual freedom is important because, we live in a modern society. Modernity starts in the late 18th century, even with the emergence of the modern science with Newton, starting with Copernicus, actually, and also the advance of capitalism. So for the first time in human history, can we say that the category of individual and her freedom becomes the most important problem from an ethical perspective. Aristotelian ethics, for example, does not care about individual herself. Individual or the person is only meaningful within a society or the polis. What is good for the polis is also good for the individual. So these are basically collectivist or social, so to speak, attitudes. Well, it's hardly social, it's mainly communitarian, I would say. The difference between the community and the society was analyzed in the early 20th century by Ferdinand Tönnies, who was the founder, one of the founders of the discipline of sociology. Basically, he argues that capitalism actually can be seen as a transition from the community to society. The society is characterized by a complex division of labor and an increasing interactions among the individuals because of the production decisions, etc. So basically, within the polis, in a community, individual relations are face-to-face relations. They are direct relations, but in a modern society, these relations are indirect relations. They are carried out by commodities and even money. Marx, for example, says that in a capitalist society, individuals carry their relations in their pockets or in their wallets. He was referring to money, of course. So basically, in a modern society, be it a capitalist one or a socialist one or any kind of society, individual freedom is of utmost importance, right? We are moderns. So we see ourselves as individuals, and our own freedom is an important issue to be solved, basically. So this ethical problem of protecting individual freedom is another problem to be solved. And the third one is the social problem, or the problem of order or social cohesion. It's the famous invisible hand idea introduced by Adam Smith. In a capitalist society or in a modern society, the division of labor actually and the exchange processes create this social cohesion or the social order on the basis of individual self-interested behavior. As we all know, there emerges a society or social relations, an invisible hand without any individual plan or desire or whatever. So in the end, we live in a society whose foundations actually were established by economic interactions and exchanges. According to this perspective, or within the liberal vision in general, the idea of the social contract is an answer to the problem of order. This problem was first formulated by Thomas Hobbes, who argued that individuals are self-interested beings, so they try to achieve their ends and they want to use whatever means they have in their possessions, including the use of violence against each other. So this is a society in which man is wolf to man, homo homini lupus. So in this case, even if individuals are free in their actions, they have no security, right? They are not safe because each individual is willing to use overt force against each other, basically. So even if we are free from an individual point of view, we have no safety in general. So in order for the society to protect the safety of individuals, there emerges an institution, which is the state. The state is a result of the social contract among the individuals in the society. And the basic function of the state is to protect social order. And of course, state uses force again to protect individual freedoms and individual rights. But the use of force by the state is basically, again, limits individual freedom. So there's a trade-off, so to speak, between individual freedom and the safety in general of the society. So if you want to establish order, you have to restrict individual freedoms. Later, John Locke actually argued that individuals are capable of understanding each other because they have the ability to use their own reasons. So on the basis of reason and intellectual discussions, etc., dialogue, basically, individuals can understand each other so they can establish a free society in which the basic function of the state is to protect individual freedom rather than restricting the individual freedoms, because free individuals, free and rational individuals, are capable of establishing a good and a stable society. You know, some people say that the American Constitution was devised along the Lockean lines, basically. It's a kind of social contract. Well, this may be true or not, but still the United States government or the state, like the rest of the world, the rest of the countries, has the power of, or the ability to use power, sheer force, to protect society or to protect social order in general, because it's the function of the state, right, basically. And even in modern political science, well, at least in its Weberian versions, the state is identified by its control over the means of violence. The only legitimate use of the means of violence, you know, army, police, etc., belongs to the state itself. Other groups or other people do not have this right, so to speak. So the legitimacy of the government, actually, the legitimacy of the state, I'm sorry, is based upon this ability to use violence, basically. So maybe Hobbes was right. But Adam Smith says, basically, with his idea of the invisible hand, we don't need state at all in order to protect society, because the self-interested behavior is enough to establish a good society. Individual human beings are characterized by their propensity to truck and barter, he says, you know, propensity to exchange. And on the basis of the exchange processes, individuals will be able to emerge without any plan or without any wish on their part, the good society or the stable social order. So the social problem order is, again, a problem. For example, in the late 19th and early 20th century, there was this debate between the liberals and the socialist economists that is called the calculation debate. And they consider these problems. Of course, the most important problem they discussed was the idea of this coordination problem. And in the 1930s, for example, it lasted until 1930s. There was this guy, Oscar Lange, I don't know how it is pronounced, Lange. He argued that socialism was better because a central planning agency is able to solve this coordination problem in a, whereas in general equilibrium setting. And this was the end of the first round of this calculation debate. In the second round, in the 1940s, Friedrich von Hayek who was actively participated in the first round of this calculation debate as well. He published an important book, The Road to Serfdom, in 1944, and in that book he argues that capitalism cannot solve these problems, actually, all of them, all three problems. First of all, it cannot solve this coordination problem because state interventions or central planning agency actually distorts the functioning of the markets. The basic function of the market is to collect, process, and disseminate piecemeal information. What I mean by this is very simple, actually. You know, for example, I want to drink coffee. As an individual, I go to the store, get some coffee, and there are many people like me who wants to drink coffee. They go to the stores or, you know, coffee shops, whatever. So there's an increase in demand for coffee in general, and the entrepreneurs actually get these signals that there's a profit opportunity in producing coffee, so they start producing coffee, and the supply of coffee increases, etc., etc. This is the idea of the working of the market. Here, prices actually carry this information. You know, whenever a price of a commodity increases, it means that there's a relative scarcity. There's an increase in the relative scarcity of this price. I'm not talking about here the general scarcity, but relative scarcity, you know, coffee relative to tea, for example. So there's if this is the case, it means that the entrepreneurs get these signals, price signals, and decide that there's a profit opportunity in producing coffee, then they enter into the market. So this is how capitalism is working, according to Hayek. Basically, this is called spontaneous order by him, just like the invisible hand. This is a more dynamic version of the theory of invisible hand. It's more dynamic because we are talking about competition here as a kind of process rather than a static setting. Competition is a process of discovery, according to Hayek. Discoverers, so to speak, are the entrepreneurs who constantly seek profit opportunities in different parts of the world. And if the market works in an efficient way, prices are able to convey these signals throughout the economy. So entrepreneurs get these signals, and they decide to produce, they decide to enter or not to enter, etc. This is how capitalism works. So no central agency is capable of solving these problems at once because, you know, this is not a static setting. Suppose that, for example, in a specific market, there increases in a specific sector. There exists an increase in the demand for a specific good. People suddenly wanted to eat more ice cream, for example. And so these signals must be disseminated within the society to the central planning agency. So it needs a kind of time. There's a time lag between the decisions of individuals, in this case, to increase their demand, and the response of the central planning agency. When the central planning agency decides to increase the production of this particular good, again, it needs a time to reach this particular sector, etc. So the time, but when the decision of the central planning agency reaches to this particular sector, people actually have already changed their attitudes or their wishes, their desires. They no longer want to buy this commodity in greater quantities, for example. So again, it will be a waste of time. So, but capitalism or the market system does this instantly, right? Through the working of the prices in general. So whenever there's a price increase in any part of the economy, it means that the relative scarcity of this particular commodity or good increases. So these signals are taken by the entrepreneurs. They decide to produce, etc., etc. This is how capitalism works. Capitalism and the competition process is a dynamic process, and there's no need for any kind of outside intervention or any kind of central planning agency to decide about the allocation of these resources among different users within the economy. So that's why Hayek maintains that capitalism cannot solve this problem of allocation. It cannot also solve the problem of freedom, according to Hayek, again, in this book, The Road to Serfdom, because any government action is necessarily coercive, forcing people to behave in a specific way. And this is not consistent with the idea of individual freedom. Individuals must be free in their choices in the first place, right? If you have to talk about individual freedom, we should consider the importance and we should respect the freedoms, individual freedoms. They are capable of doing whatever they want to do. This is the basic idea. Freedom of choice. So, but government interventions actually forces people to behave in certain ways. And in the socialism, for example, state or government in general forces individual to act in a way that is against their rational will, for example, etc. And also the social problem of order in a socialist society, according to Hayek again, the social order can only be protected through force, right? Since there's no individual freedom, and in order for the protection of the society or social order, individual freedoms must be restricted again in a Hobbesian way. So Hobbes's characterization actually close enough to a socialist society. So this is the ideas of Hayek's in his famous and important book, The Road to Serfdom. I would recommend you to read it, basically. It's a nice book, and it has had an important impact throughout the world, actually. Milton Friedman, for example, says in the introduction of this book, written by himself, says that the Iron Curtain, actually, one of the reasons for the collapse of the Iron Curtain could be could be this book, this particular book, because people read Hayek and reflect upon the things that he says, etc., etc. So basically, the liberal answer to these questions are very much we teach in our economics classes, but the heterodox or socialist or Marxist economists, on the other hand, reject these because for them, for example, capitalism is not be able to solve the coordination problem by itself. Even Keynes says this, right? In his book, The General Theory of Employment, Money and Interest. Employment, interest, and money, whatever. In that book, the market society, market system cannot ensure a full employment equilibrium, even if there's an equilibrium in the sense of the equality between aggregate demand and aggregate supply. The deficiency of what he calls effective demand may prevent the economy from reaching full employment level. So this is a less than full employment equilibrium level. The reason for this is that the decisions of the firms cannot be made harmonized with the decisions of the firms. This is the full extent of the problem of the coordination among individual decision units in a capitalist economy. For this reason, argues Keynes, the government should intervene into the working of the economy, especially in the form of increasing government spending, so that the aggregate demand or the effective demand can be increased through some actions on the part of the state or the government. decreasing taxes or increasing spending, or through the central bank actions, money supply and so forth, we can correct or even stabilize the economy, according to him. And on the other hand, but Keynes also believes that capitalism is a good system in protecting individual freedoms. He was no socialist, and he says about socialism something like this: I cannot prefer a system, I cannot defend a system which prefers the mud to the fish. He says something like this. This is a kind of populist. Socialism is a kind of populist thing, but Keynes was a Cambridge intellectual, so he was one of the social elites, and he's very important, so he doesn't like these working class movements, etc. He doesn't like the majority of people, and he sees himself as different and above the society and so forth, so he can never be a socialist, as he says. But he was aware of the problem associated with the working of the market system, so the state can help the system in achieving full employment. Other than that, there's no problem with capitalism, because capitalism is better and even best in protecting individual freedom. It is based upon an individualistic philosophy, and this individualistic philosophy was adopted by Keynes himself. And also capitalism, according to him, is good for the protecting a stable social order with a little help of the government, maybe. And Marxists, on the other hand, argue that, for example, Marx believes that capitalism cannot solve this coordination problem. Even more than that, it is not capable of creating and protecting individual freedom, because, in a capitalist society, individuals are forced to supply into the market whatever they have, including their own labor power. But what we call labor power is the energy or the physical and mental capacities and capabilities that the individual has, or it refers to the transformative power of individuals. And this power, human property, actually becomes a commodity. It is separated from its owner, from the human being, and it becomes a commodity, and the relations among individuals become relations among commodities. And even our lives are governed and controlled by commodities, including money, right? That's the basic idea. This is his famous theory of alienation, or later commodity fetishism. Commodities are just like gods who control our lives, basically, in a nutshell. So this is not a situation in which individuals are free. And also the social problem of order cannot be solved by capitalism, because capitalism creates conflicts among or between social classes, basically between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And this social conflict, or the class struggle in general, creates some instabilities in the process of reproducing of the social system. Basically, sooner or later, with the help of the crises, also, this class struggle will intensify and lead to the collapse of capitalism. So this is not a society or an economic system that can reproduce itself without any problem. So this is his understanding. Anyway, so with regard to the coordination problem, we can distinguish from a methodological point of view, of course, among three important points. One is the versions of coordination problem. One is the synchronic version of coordination problem. Coordination in a static setting, planned investment and savings are equal, as in the macroeconomics definition. of equilibrium. It's a kind of static equilibrium. It takes a specific point of time and it doesn't care about the changes or adjustment process between different points of equilibrium. You know, remember the market equilibrium graphics? We have a downward demand, sloping demand curve, an upward sloping supply curve. Equilibrium is defined whenever there's a change in demand or supply as a whole. This particular curve will shift and we will have a new equilibrium, but the adjustment from the old equilibrium to the new equilibrium point is not explained. It is assumed that this adjustment occurs instantly. You know, this is a static setting of analysis in general. There's also a diachronic version. It's a comparative static or shifting equilibrium point of view. Keynes's idea is something like that. You know, in this case, economists are concerned with different points of equilibrium. And the coordination in a general equilibrium setting. Well, actually, the difference between the synchronic and the diachronic ones is not great. It is negligible because in one, we only consider in the synchronic perspective, we consider one equilibrium point, how it is formed. In the other, we consider the changes in the equilibrium points by themselves. You know, the ISLM model is a kind of explanation for this. Whenever there's an increase in the money supply or government spending, the LM curve or the IS curve will shift and a new equilibrium will occur, etc., etc. There's also a dynamic side of the order problem, which is described by Hayek. You know, it's his version is a more dynamic version. He says competition is a dynamic process. For this reason, for example, he opposed the formal general equilibrium models because these models, according to him, are static models, so they cannot show how competition and therefore how markets function in general, because competition is a dynamic process. The quantities of demand and supply continuously change. So whenever there's a change, there should be a new kind of adjustment process, and this adjustment process will create some kind of dynamic setting. So dynamic order is, from a technical point of view, of course, is a little hard to solve, and for this, it is basically concerned with the evolution, so to speak, of the system itself. For this reason, Alfred Marshall, a famous economist, says that these words, Mecca, the Mecca of economists, he say, is economic biology. His book is a static book, adopts a static equilibrium perspective, but he was aware of the importance of this adjustment and evolutionary processes in the working of capitalism, but you know, the techniques that are in his possession were not enough to analyze this dynamic side of the thing. These days, for example, economists try to use some techniques that are borrowed from physics, again, such as the theory of complexity, for example, and also chaos theory and so forth. So these days, economics take a more dynamic perspective according to the working of the market system in general. Why are these versions important? Because they determine basically how economics is made. And this is a distinction again by Joseph Schumpeter. And he distinguishes between two models of the economy, two models about the working of the economy. One model is hitchless, what he calls hitchless models, and the other is hitch-bound. In a hitchless model, Schumpeter argues that the economy or the system is capable of reproducing itself without any problems. We can, for example, think of an engine which continues to work throughout time without any kind of outside intervention or outside help, external help. So it's capable of reproducing itself continuously. It's like a self-perpetuating machine, right? So hitchless models is basically closed models. They try to close the system, and the best way of closing the system is to use these ceteris paribus clauses. Let's assume that this is constant, that is constant, etc., etc. This is the meaning of the closure in general. And their method is either static or comparative static. As I said, there are no great differences between this. And its order is basically spontaneous order, or the idea of invisible hand, which is efficient, in the microeconomic general equilibrium theory and the welfare economics that was developed on the basis of the general equilibrium theory. Allocation is considered as Pareto efficient, right? No one could be made better without making others in the society worse. This is the basic idea of Pareto efficiency. Of course, Pareto efficiency is only one definition of efficiency. There may be other definitions, but this is the most preferred definition by the economists in general. So on the basis of this, we can develop and prove two fundamental theorems of welfare economics, right? Every welfare is in equilibrium, every general equilibrium is a Pareto efficient allocation, and any Pareto efficient allocation can be made a Walrasian equilibrium. They show more or less the same thing. So capitalism is capable of reaching general equilibrium. All markets are in equilibrium simultaneously. And this equilibrium also characterizes the best allocation. This is the best society. Capitalism, or the market society, is the best. And also, if there's any disturbance or instability in the working of the system, its source must be coming from the outside of the system. It must be external. If there's a problem, for example, if the problem is inflation, according to these people, according to monetarists and neoclassical economists, for example, it is because of the behavior of the central bank, right? So if central bank tries to increase money supply, it will have no effect on the real variables such as output and employment, at least in the long run, and then all the remaining effect will be in the increase in the prices. There will be inflation, right? So if there's inflation as a problem, which is a macroeconomic disturbance, so to speak, then its source is the central bank. It's external to the system. Of if there's any problem in the working of the market in general, it is because of the existence of trade unions, for example, in the labor market, or the actions of the government. If governments enforces some kind of price controls or rent controls, for example, the market cannot work efficiently. So if there's any problem within the reproduction of the system, it should be coming from outside of the system. It's external. But on the other hand, within the hitch-bound systems, the economy, the model is an open model, changes and adjustments and evolutions are considered. And it also has some dynamic elements. Its change is one of the most important issues with which economists are concerned. It takes an evolutionary perspective, and the source of instability is external. For example, Schumpeterian characterization of capitalism is similar to that of Hayek, actually, Schumpeter himself. belongs to the Austrian school of economics, just like as Hayek himself. Although there are some interesting differences between the two, but Schumpeter also says that competition is a dynamic process, and also the idea of evolution, or as he calls development, is important in the working of capitalism, and he characterizes this system as the creative destruction process. It's a creative process because capitalism is a dynamic system and is capable of creating new technologies, innovations, and continuously. It's also a destructive process because the introduction of new technologies or new innovations will make the older ones obsolete, right? When computers were introduced, whole structure of the industry, of any industry, changed, right? Without computers or without the internet, we could not have this class online, etc. So it destroyed typewriters, for example. We no longer, anyone actually in these days use typewriters again, right? We use computers, etc. So it's a process of creative destruction. On the one hand, it creates new opportunities of profit from the point of view of the entrepreneurs, and it is the function, it is the job actually of the entrepreneurs to introduce these kinds of innovations. The entrepreneur herself need not have this discovery of the new technology, but she actually is functional in introducing a new technology into the production process or in the process of marketing or any kind of process that is significant from an economic point of view. It is his ideas, Schumpeter's ideas. So this is a dynamic perspective about the working of the capitalism. And again, Marx has a similar thing, but Marx thinks that sooner or later capitalism is doomed to collapse because of the increasing tendencies of crisis, especially the fall in the rate of profit will create increasing problems about working of the capitalism, and at one point it will collapse because of these instabilities. So these perspectives argues that the system is not self-propelling, so to speak. It cannot reproduce itself continuously. Even Keynes has a similar idea, right? You know, capitalism, in order for capitalism to reproduce itself, it needs some help from the government or from the state in general. The idea of the welfare state was a Keynesian invention, right? Basically. So, of course, Schumpeter says that this is a matter of methodological choice. You know, first we start with a hitchless model, and then we can enter some properties of hitch-bound elements, etc., so that we can reach a more dynamic perspective. But usually, if we look at the history of economic thought, we can see that mainstream economists or neoclassical economists, or also monetarists and neoclassical economists, prefer these kind of hitchless models. You know, economy is capable of reproducing itself without any problem. On the other hand, heterodox economists, non-mainstream economists, whatever you call them, prefer the hitch-bound models. So this is one interesting thing. These are comparisons between Marx and Schumpeter, for example. You know, in Marx and Schumpeter's analyses of capitalism actually are similar, but you know, in Marx, for example, the equilibrium is considered as important, as an important outcome of competition, although Marx also argues that competition is also destructive for the reproduction of the system, just like Adam Smith, because on the one hand, it creates the tendencies of equilibrium, but on the other hand, it brings about some instabilities in the working of the system. And Schumpeter's account is considered by some economists as a non-equilibrium economics. It's a kind of thermodynamic equilibrium, so to speak. We don't need to go into detail of this. And they both talk about evolution and order. And they are similar again. And according to Marx, for example, the source of instability is the process of accumulation itself. And also these problems of alienation and fetishism. But for Schumpeter, the idea of creative destruction and the resultant bureaucratization of creative destruction. He argues that in his famous book, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, which is an important book, I would recommend you to read that. He argues that in the 40s, in the 1942, I guess it was published. He argues that capitalism is losing its competitive edge and its ability to create new technologies because of the increasing bureaucratization of the big corporations. This idea of bureaucratization is a Weberian idea. Schumpeter follows Max Weber in this regard. And Weber argues that capitalism is characterized by an increasing bureaucratization process. In the end, people will lose their spontaneity because they become some functioning parts or some functioning units of a machine. He has his famous metaphor of iron cage. Even if capitalism creates new possibilities for our freedom in general, but the working of the system and its complex division of labor reduces individuals to some kind of functional units of a giant working machine. So this is the idea of iron cage. And Schumpeter also adopts this idea and argues in the 1940s that capitalism entered into a phase in which creative destruction process was coming to an end because of the increasing bureaucratization or the petrification process. This was in 1940s, and that time was characterized by increasing monopolies in the capitalism. It's called, even by Marxists, as the monopoly capitalism. The arguments are the same, more or less. Imperfect competition conditions and increasing monopolization actually controls the productive activity and productive machine in general. So, these monopolies create some problems for the consumers in general. For one, they charge higher prices, higher than they should be, when there is perfect competition, etc. So according to Schumpeter, in the 1940s, capitalism has lost its competitive edge, its dynamic edge. But, Schumpeter died in 1953, I guess. He did not see the computer revolution, IT revolutions, etc. And the increasing technological inventions occurred in the late 70s or in the early 70s even. 70s and 80s, the computer revolution, especially introduction of personal computers and later the internet. These innovations actually were brought up by not by some giant corporations at that time. We're talking about 1970s, but by some individual entrepreneurs. Think about Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, for example. Sure, IBM started first personal computer, not first, but its own version of personal computer. But the creation of IBM compatible computers by individual entrepreneurs actually changed the whole structure of the computer business and also the world. There's an interesting documentary about this. Actually, you can find it on the YouTube, I guess. It's called The Triumph of the Nerds. That's a very interesting documentary. It was made in the 1990s, actually. And
I'm Bob Quinsley, and I'm...
Let me see. Did I share this? No. Okay, share a new one. This documentary, Triumph of the Nerds, and there are some interesting history of this computer thing. For example, this is Steve Wozniak, Apple, etc. And Apple guy. So these are things. This is an interesting history of the home computer. 3 parts it has. I would recommend you to read it. There's also a book version of it, or watch it. Triumph of the Nerds. Isn't this interesting? It's a very interesting documentary. I would recommend you to read it. So this Schumpeter thought that the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th century was the outcome of some individual actions of some entrepreneurs who actually introduced new technologies, basically. At that time, there was no great companies or corporations, only individual entrepreneurs introduced new techniques. So capitalism dynamic edge actually is based upon these activities or actions of the entrepreneur. He even says that the entrepreneur is similar to the knights in the medieval period. They act on the basis of adventure and so forth. They don't care about money much, although in the end they will have great sums of money, etc. So capitalism, the dynamism, is based upon individual entrepreneurial behavior. Again, similar to Hayek. Hayek doesn't talk about innovations and technological changes, but he argues that competition is a discovery process in which the signals about the relative scarcities are sought and exploited by the entrepreneurs. And Schumpeter adds to this picture the entrepreneur's function of introducing new technologies, etc. So again, this is a dynamic process and instability for both Marx and Schumpeter. We can say that the success of capitalism actually leads to its own failure. The failure of capitalism in the form of collapse because of the crisis in Marx, or in the form of bureaucratization process, stopping the dynamic edge, losing the dynamic edge, is actually a result of the success of capitalism in introducing new technologies, etc. So this is the, again, metaphor of engine. Engine works by itself, but it still creates some problems which will bring an end to this working of the engine itself. This is an interesting idea. On the other hand, as to the problem of the protecting and creating and protecting freedom, individual freedom, we can mention three facts. One idea is the increasing inequalities that capitalism creates, even these days. These inequalities became a very important problem, right? a vast portion of the wealth is lying at the hand of a few people, such as Jeff Bezos and what was the name of this Tesla guy? Musk. Musk also bought Twitter, I guess, right? So basically, monopolization and restriction of individual freedom and increasing inequalities is an important problem of the late capitalism, as they would say. By late, of course, contemporary capitalism, we mean. And also freedom and autonomy. This is the idea of iron cage, as I talked about. Capitalism creates some opportunities for individual freedom and also for creating a more democratic society. General education, for example, is a product of capitalism. In the beginning of the 20th century, for example, it was introduced in England and much later in other parts of the world. So this is interesting. Before capitalism, no one cares about the education of the common people, right? Education is a privilege for the upper levels of the society. First, the landed aristocracy, then the bourgeoisie, and so forth. No one cared about the working class, education of the working class. But in the beginning of the 20th century, it became a general property. And also, for example, the right to vote was not recognized. The right to vote for the working class was not recognized by the British authorities until the beginning of the 20th century again. That's interesting because before, for example, in the beginning of the 19th century, only the landlords are entitled to vote, and then bourgeoisie has had this right to vote. And one of the first working class movements, for example, was the Chartist movement in the 1830s, and their political agenda was achieving this right to vote. That's interesting. So capitalism also made us conscious about the importance of individual freedom and democracy and so forth. So in that sense, capitalism creates new possibilities or new opportunities for protecting individual. Even the idea of the human rights, we can say, is a product of capitalism, starting with liberalism, right? Liberalism emphasizes the importance of individual freedoms and so forth. So the society is needed to be a more free and democratic society. This was a long and arduous struggle. Okay, so the third problem is the idea of alienation and fetishism thing. Individuals, people, human beings are concerned with realizing their own potentialities, right, in the Aristotelian way, but capitalism forces us to behave as homo economicus, rational economic people who is concerned with our self-interest only. We don't care about the rest of the society. We have no friends, families, loved ones, etc., etc. But this create a form of alienation and also fetishism, because we lose our spontaneity and power of making transformation because it becomes a commodity, etc. There's a relationship between this idea of iron cage and the alienation, and some people even argue that Marx Weber actually talked about the same thing. Marxists usually like this idea, but still they are similar, especially in regard of the behavior within the market, because if you enter into the market, no matter what you want, you have to behave like, you have to act like a homo economicus. So capitalism, in the sense, creates a kind of schizophrenia even, right? In the market, we have to be rational economic units. In the rest of the society, out of the market, we can become political animals again, etc. So these are the problems. And as regard to the problem of order, there are some interesting fault lines of the market societies which hinder them to reproduce themselves in a continuous way, without any kind of problem. One is the institutional separation of the economic and the political spheres, which was emphasized by Marx and also by Weber, and above all, Karl Polanyi, in his famous book, The Great Transformation. He argues that capitalism is based upon this institutional separation. Economic sphere is the market, actually, the market institution. Market is a self-regulating market. It works on the basis of self-interested behavior. Within the market, we have to act like rational economic units, etc. But within the political sphere, we can realize our own potentialities in a social setting, etc. So basically, Polanyi argues that in order for the self-regulating market to operate, to function without any problem, there should be no intervention on the part of the political sphere of the society. By political, we mean the state in the first place, of course, and also some agencies, some political agencies that are capable of intervening into the working of the market, such as the trade unions, for example, and also political parties, social democratic parties in the late 19th century. In England, for example, it was a Marxist party, so they tried to change the structure of the society and also economy, etc., etc. So, and this is the main problem for capitalism, according to Polanyi, to reproduce itself, because these political interventions on the part of the political sphere increased from the beginning of the system itself. Basically, these interventions usually take the form of self-protection of the society, which means actually people try to curb the extension of the market. If you leave the market to its own devices, it will change, it will transform the whole structure of the economy. It will make all of us as rational economic being, even if our own social lives, right? When we are dealing with our loved ones, for example, we try to make these comparisons between costs and benefits, etc., etc. So basically, against this self-protecting form of society, according to Polanyi, was developed on the part of the society, social classes, political parties, trade unions, different forms of agencies, which actually created problem in the reproduction of the economic or the economic sphere or the market sphere. And by the 1930s, after the war, the first war, of course, these struggles between these two sides, extension of the market on one side, and the self-protection of the society on the other, created increasing problems for the reproduction of the society as a whole. And in the 1930s, according to Polanyi, competitive capitalism, competitive market system, collapsed actually. In the form of fascism, Nazism, Stalin's 5-year plans, and the New Deal in the United States in 1933. Because these developments actually created the Great Depression of 1929, which actually signifies the collapse of the market system, according to Polanyi. Maybe he's right, I don't know. But this institutional separation between economic and the political spheres must be protected at all costs. For Polanyi, and he argues that even fascism was a solution to protect this separation by using force, brutal force even, because working class movement became a danger in the 1920s, and this danger must be eliminated by force, which was the basic function of fascism in general, according to him. And also another situation in which we still live, maybe, this separation between our own, between the two conceptions about our own. One is the individual atom, the other is social being. We are social beings, political animals, as Aristotle taught us, right? But market forces us to behave as atoms, right? Individuals who are concerned with their own self-interest. The rest of the society, we don't care, etc. This is another fault line of the society, because, you know, against the extension of the market, against the development, against the extension of the view of atoms, we try to protect ourselves, our own sociality, by combining together, by coming together, forming different agencies, political parties, trade unions, etc., etc. Even some kind of communities whose basic function is not economic, but social, in the sense that we try to affirm our own connectedness and being social beings in general, so that we can realize our own potentialities within the confines of these communities, And also the idea of the double movement, Polanyi's idea, notion, or extension of the market versus societal or protectionist counter movement. You know, market continuously expands its limits so as to include every institution of society, such as the state, education, art, even family, and even religion, according to some, etc. So instead of this, against this, I'm sorry, people try to protect their own sociality and their own senses of connectivity or feeling of connectedness, etc., which will create, again, in the working or reproducing of the market in general. So basically, if you look at different criticisms regarding the working of capitalism in general, we can make this classification. One is about the institutional structure of the system, you know, Homo economicus versus political animals. Marx, Weber, and Polanyi are the main representatives of this view. And the other is Keynes. This economic efficiency, social justice, and individual freedom are Keynes' own words. He says, any social and economic system must solve these problems at once. One is the economic efficiency. The other is protecting social justice, creating and protecting social justice, and also individual freedom. Keynes argues that capitalism is good in protecting economic efficiency. Actually, it's the most efficient system, but still, in terms of achieving full employment equilibrium, it may experience some problems, in which case state actions are necessary. On the other hand, it's not good for protecting social justice in the sense of protecting distributive justice, you know, equality of the in the distribution of income in general. But it's also good, according to Keynes, to create and protect individual freedom. So he says that, again, capitalism is best, with a little problem, of course, problem of achieving a full employment equilibrium by itself. So we need government actions or interventions. And also coordination failures, investment saving equality. Externalities is an interesting subject. You may have seen it. Externality is a situation that cannot be handled by the market, positive and negative externalities, right? Pollution is a kind of negative externalities. If the lake in which the fishermen and women fish, yeah, they do fish, right? If it's polluted, it will affect the fisher people in general living around this lake, right? Even if they had nothing to do with the creation of this pollution. A factory, for example, pollutes the lake or the river, whatever. So it will create some kind of negative externality. An example to the positive externality, almost the only example, is the flower garden and the bee colony, right? Bees go to the flower garden, get some whatever they get and produce honey. So the owner of the garden is not harmed by this because she sells flowers. On the other hand, the seller of the bee will get some benefits actually, which she does not pay, right? So in some cases, especially like pollution and the climate crisis, for example, the market cannot handle this. Who is going to pay the price of pollution, right? For this reason, they argue that Pigo, for example, introduced this notion. A government tax may be necessary, right? If a factory pollutes the lake or the environment, it should pay it. It should be punished in form of tax, etc. So there are attempts at internalizing, so to speak, these kinds of externalities. Public good is another interesting form of externality in general. The government has the function of producing some investments, for example, public investments, such as infrastructure investments, for example, which are necessary for the working of the system in general, but no individual private firm or agency is willing to undertake these kinds of investment. Public parks, for example, is good for all of us, but it should be produced by the government or by the state, etc. So these are all coordination failures of the market system that the market system creates. And also crises is an important outcome of capitalism. Capitalism, it seems, undergoes periodic economic fluctuations and crises, right? In 1897, for example, I guess there was a crisis. It was called as the Great Depression before the 1929 crisis. Actually, again, 1929, in the 1930s, there had been this Great Depression. Some people say that in the 70s, there was another great crisis caused by the oil crisis and created stagflation and so forth. And again, recently, 2008 crisis, financial crisis, which was spreading to other parts of the economy. And these days, people again fear about the possibility of a new crisis, depression coupled with inflation. That's an interesting case again. So basically, if you leave capitalism to its own devices, it may not, and it appears that it does not solve these kinds of problems. One problem is the reproduction of the institutional structure. The other is problem of inequalities and protecting social justice, because capitalism does not aim at creating justice. Well, some people like Hayek argues that it's not the job of capitalism to create an equal distribution of income, But this does not necessarily imply that this is an unjust distribution, because in a distributive scheme in which every party or every individual gets a share that is equal or proportional to its own or her own contribution to the national output or production in general, then it will be a just society. It will not be equal distribution, but it will be a just distribution because everyone gets a share which is equal to her own contribution. Remember the marginal productivity theory. If every factor gets a share that is equal to its own contribution, national output will be divided among the owners of these factors. So each factor getting a share equal to its own contribution. It's a just distribution of income, not necessarily equal, because some of us may have greater contributions than the others. Makes sense, but some people argue that, for example, these inequalities has little to do with the properties or capabilities of individuals. If you are born rich, for example, you will get a better education, you will have greater opportunities, life opportunities open to you, you will have greater opportunities of profit, you will have control of a vast wealth, etc. You know, people talk about the price of the Twitter as like 44 billion US dollars, right? 44 billion US dollars. Anyway, so institutional and social factors also important in the distribution of income, and people, especially non-economists, criticize economists for not considering the importance of these economic and social factors that will result in inequalities. No inequality today can be explained, they say, on the basis of personal abilities, personal gifts, whatever, etc. Anyway, so basically, invisible hand as a tendency exists, it works, but there are also some counter effects which hinders the working of the invisible hand in the most efficient way. So usually liberal economists argue that individual hand is an efficient system. It produces efficient results, efficient allocation of resources and protection of freedom, etc. But other people, even Marx says that invisible hand is important. Not directly, he says, but he accepts Adam Smith's vision in that particular sense. There's an invisible hand working, but this invisible hand does not always create most efficient results. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, some people say, right? So basically, we can distinguish between two forms of unintended consequences or invisible hand. One is the harmonious version of invisible hand. Social contract theories, liberal economics in general, the optimality of order is emphasized, individualist social theory and social atomism. Hayek is one of the most important representatives of this view. And there's, of course, a problem with that. It emphasizes free will, but it is based upon a kind of functionalism. What is functionalism? Hayek's presentation of the working of competition is a kind of a functional unit. It argues basically that the fundamental function of the prices is to collect to process and to disseminate information, piecemeal information about the relative scarcities. This is meaning that the whole institutional structure of the economy exists for fulfilling some particular function. Why do we have society? For the allocation of resources, for example, etc. And there's also a kind of evolutionary hand conception, which is a more dynamic one. Creation and reproduction of the system, the capacity of self-reproducing of the system itself, but also it has some imperfections and suboptimalities. Again, Polanyi, Marx, and Schumpeter. They are most, social or collectivist, so to speak, in orientation. Also, we can say that in between, we can talk about an invisible backhand, which means like Keynes, for example, capitalism, is capable of reproducing itself. It has the, it has the ability to reproduce itself without much problems, but at the same time, it will create some unintended effects, bad, suboptimal, non-efficient effects. In Keynes, for example, capitalism is able to reach an equilibrium, but this equilibrium need not correspond to full employment equilibrium. This is important. And once the system is out of equilibrium, it may never return to this full employment equilibrium. Only by chance can the full employment be achieved, according to him. So this is an example of the invisible backhand. It's a tennis term, I guess. But mostly, on the one hand, we have a harmonious vision of the invisible hand, which argues that the invisible hand works always in an efficient manner. And the other is non-efficient order or evolutionary hand, that was called by some evolutionary economists, Giovanni Dossi, for example. And it says basically reproduction, social and economic reproduction, is a dynamic process, and within this dynamic process, changes and also problems occur, and the result is not always the creation of efficient results. You know, the example they use, for example, one of the examples they use is the idea of this chaos theory. Dissipative structures, you know, structures are formed through the working of the system, but these structures are also subject to dissipation, subject to vanish almost. So this is a process full of contradictions in the reproduction process. Ruptures, discontinuous. You know, this process is like the punctuated equilibrium. There's an equilibrium, there's an evolution that goes on, but at some particular points, there appear some options for the system, and the system chooses one of these options, and there's no reason, there's no deterministic process explaining this choice, so to speak. It could be, this choice could be taking any form. Instead of A, it could take B or C or whatever. Only by chance, actually, any path of evolution is chosen, and it's a path-dependent process. And once this choice is made, we have to live with its consequences. In the history of technology, for example, in technology studies, this idea is used. For example, an example is an interesting, for example, in the beginning of the 20th century, in the 1920s, there had been three forms of engines of the cars. One is the steam engine, interestingly. The other is The electric car and the technology is quite similar. You know, there are batteries, they are charged, so they put you put these batteries into the car and you go. The difference, of course, is the efficiency of battery, maybe. And the other is the type of engine that we still use today. What is called well, I keep forgetting it. Whatever. You know, most of us have this technology in our cars. My God, I'm getting old, sorry. Self-something. Self-combustive, is it? Yes. Self-combustion. Yeah, something like that. Some people say that, for example, the steam engine disappeared because, you know, it's not practical. You have to find a river, a source of water, because steam engine uses water naturally. And so it's not practical. And the electric car, the idea of electric car was abandoned because, again, it's not practical. The problem is recharging the batteries, right? Especially for the long distances, which is still a problem, right? Electric cars have this problem. You may not use them efficiently in long distance travels. And we have, again, self-combustion engines, unfortunately or fortunately. So one option was chosen, and it's a path dependence in the sense that we have to stick with this path. We have to go until it comes to an end. An interesting example is the famous QWERTY phenomenon. You know, QWERTY, QWERTY, is the letters on our computers. That particular alignment of letters was developed for mechanical typewriters because it does not create great problems when typing. You know, when you want to type by using these typewriters, they get meshed into each other, the arms of the letters. So this particular alignment is the best way of minimizing these kind of problems. For example, in Turkish, a counterpart, we have the F keyword, not keyword, F type. Instead of Q, we have F. And I think I can use it. I still use it, this F type. I think this is the best arrangement of letters for the Turkish language. It was developed in the 1950s, I guess. But unfortunately, these days, because of the computer building firms effects, so to speak, we are forced to use some interesting alignment that is called Turkish Q. It's not English Q, it's not Turkish, but it's Turkish Q. Anyway, the path dependence thing is that still, you know, after the 1970s, we all start using computers, and in computers, we don't have these kinds of mechanical problems, you know, and meshing of these letters and so forth, but still we use this kind of Q alignment, right? Why? Because once we have chosen, humanity has chosen this particular alignment because of the effect of some typewriter companies, still we are stuck with that Q type, right? Or Turkish Q type, whatever. Anyway, so evolution is a process full of contradictions and full of chances even. You cannot predict the outcome of the system. This is the difference between the chaos theory and the Newtonian understanding of any system. In a Newtonian system, we are told a small change in the beginning conditions will create a proportional change in the end, in the outcomes. But in the chaotic systems, even if there's a small problem or small changes in the beginning, some big changes may be created. The famous butterfly effect. A butterfly may create great hurricanes in the Pacific. A butterfly in Africa may create great hurricanes in Pacific or whatever. Anyway, so you cannot predict and even control, of course, the behavior of the system according to this, because evolutionary processes are full of chance, full of ruptures, discontinuities. The reality itself, any kind of reality, biological, natural, social, and even economic reality, is not a process that cannot be characterized as a process, as nature does not make leaps, right? Nature does make leaps and so forth. Anyway, so in economics, still most of the economists, I would say, adopt a kind of efficient outlook, efficient version of the, yes, I think that's enough, invisible hand ideas. But economic reality is not or cannot be characterized by this invisible hand approach, which considers only efficient outcomes, etc. There are crises, there are ruptures, there are changes, there are inefficiencies in the reproduction processes in economic reality, and especially in capitalism. Capitalism is capable of reproducing itself, but there will always be problems in this reproduction process. And these problems will be caused by some internal factors rather than by some external factors. The crisis theory in the neoclassical economics or liberal economics is usually attributing the sources of these crises to some external factors such as shocks, technology shocks, shocks in oil prices, shocks in actions of the government, unannounced central bank policies, etc., etc. So the crisis, the system, by its own working, does not create any kind of hardship or crisis. If there is any problem in the working of the system, it must be because of some external factors. This is usually, more or less, the outlook, the vision of the capitalist system. I think that concludes our discussion, or my discussion, whatever.